All right, so get ready because we're about to go on a deep dive into the world of Android visual controls.
Yeah, like all those calendars and lists and grids.
Yeah, all the stuff that makes our phones, well, usable.
Right, exactly. And, they might seem pretty basic on the surface,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
but there's actually a lot of thought and engineering that goes into making them work so well, especially with these things called adapters.
Adapters. Okay, I gotta admit, that's a new one for me. We're working with that DMC 06 control.pdf document today, right?
Yes, exactly. It's a Romanian document.
Of course it is.
Yeah, all about mobile device calculations, and specifically we're looking at Chapter 6, which dives into all these visual controls.
Very cool. So by the end of this deep dive, we should have a good grasp on how these controls work and maybe even get some ideas for how we could use them.
Yeah, totally.
Let's start with something I think everyone's pretty familiar with. The calendar view.
Perfect. Think about when you open your calendar app and you see that nice, neatly laid out calendar all ready for you to pick a date. That's the calendar view control doing its thing.
And I bet you most people don't even realize that how that calendar looks can actually change depending on what version of Android they're using or even the theme they have on their phone.
That's a really good point. It's a good reminder that developers need to think about all these variations to make sure the experience is consistent for everyone.
For sure. So how do we actually control what the calendar view shows?
Well, there are attributes like max date and mind date.
Okay.
So say you're building a hotel booking app. You could use these attributes to stop users from picking dates in the past or too far in the future.
So it's not just about showing the calendar, but it's about guiding how the user interacts with it too.
Precisely. And then there's this method called getDate, which is what you use to get the selected date. But here's where things get a little geeky.
Oh, I love the geeky parts. Hit me with it.
All right, so instead of giving you the date in a simple day, month, year format, getDate gives you the time in milliseconds that have passed since January 1st, 1970.
1970. Why 1970?
That's the Unix epoch. It's a big deal in computer history. That's when the Unix operating system started, and it's this common reference point for measuring time in lots of different systems.
So using milliseconds since that date kind of creates a universal time language that works across different systems.
Exactly. It makes calculations simpler and keeps things consistent in how time is handled.
That's really fascinating. Okay, so we've talked about picking dates, but what about when you need to schedule something at a particular time? Like when you're setting an alarm or booking an appointment.
Right, and for that we have the date picker and time picker controls. They're kind of like calendar view's siblings.
Okay.
They let users pick specific times or even date and time combinations.
It's like a whole toolkit for dealing with time in your app.
Totally.
Yeah.
And you can even use these controls as dialogues, which is really helpful for keeping things clean, especially in apps where you have a lot of, fields for people to fill out.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So let's break these controls down a bit more. What's the difference between date picker and time picker?
Well, the date picker is all about choosing a specific day, month, and year. It's got these methods that make it easy to grab those values.
And time picker, I'm guessing that's for, picking the time.
You got it. It lets the user set the hour and minute, and there are methods for pulling those values too. Interestingly, these controls have actually changed over the different versions of Android.
Oh, really?
For instance, some of the ways you handle time selection actually changed back in API level 23.
So even these seemingly basic controls have a bit of a history to them. They've been updated and improved over time.
Totally. And to make things even more flexible, you can use something called simple date format to format how the output from these controls looks. So basically, you could display the date and time info exactly how you want it to appear in your app.
Okay, starting to see how much detail goes into even the simplest parts of an app. So we've got calendars, we've got time pickers down. Now, how about those lists we see everywhere? Think about your email inbox or a social media feed. Those endless scrolling lists of items.
All right, so that's where list view comes in. It's specifically designed to show items vertically, one after the other, and it lets you scroll through what could be a huge amount of data.
But if we're just talking about displaying text, couldn't we just use a bunch of text views? What makes list view so special?
That's where things get really interesting. List view doesn't actually work alone. It uses something called an adapter to manage and display all that data.
An adapter? Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about what an adapter does.
Think of it like this. You have a box full of ingredients, that's your data, and you want to make a delicious meal. Well, the adapter is like the chef who takes those ingredients, follows a recipe that's the layout, and creates a beautiful dish, the visual representation you see in your app.
Okay, I love that analogy. So the adapter is like this bridge between the raw data and how it's actually shown in the list view.
Exactly. And the cool thing is that there are different types of adapters depending on what you need to do.
Mm.
You've got the array adapter for simple lists, the simple adapter for more structured data, and then there's the really powerful base adapter for when you need complete customization.
Wow, a whole hierarchy of adapters. I'm starting to see how powerful these things are. But before we dive into all those different adapter types, I'm curious, what about when you need to display stuff in a grid, not a list? Like the icons on our home screens or those image gallery layouts.
Ah, great question. That's where grid view comes in.
Okay.
It's very similar to list view in that it still uses adapters to manage the data, but instead of showing items vertically, it displays them in a two-dimensional grid.
So list view and grid view, they both use adapters to handle the data and display, but list view is for vertical lists, grid view is for those grid layouts.
You got it. And with grid view, you can even decide how many columns you want in your grid. Then the items will automatically fill in, row by row, creating that grid-like structure.
Okay, starting to see a pattern here. Adapters seem like the key to making these lists and grids work. Can we break down these different adapter types a little more? I'm especially curious about that base adapter you mentioned, the one that lets you customize everything.
Absolutely. Let's delve a bit deeper into the world of adapters and explore how they bring your data to life in your Android apps.
So we've got list view and grid view, both using these adapters to handle and show the data, one in a list, the other in a grid. It's pretty cool how much goes on behind the scenes to make something as simple as a list look and work so smoothly.
It really is. And all those different types of adapters, they give you a whole bunch of options for how that data is presented and even how people interact with it.
That's what I'm really interested in. We talked about array adapter, simple adapter, and base adapter. Let's dig into those a bit more. Starting with array adapter, what's so special about it?
Array adapter is your go-to adapter for simple lists. Imagine you have a list of names, you just want to display them. Array adapter is perfect for that. It takes your array or array list of strings and it just displays them in the list view without any fuss.
So it's all about keeping things simple and efficient.
Exactly. And when you set up the array adapter, you tell it which layout to use for each item in the list and which text view in that layout should hold the data. It's like you're giving it a blueprint and saying, put each name for my list right here.
I like that. Makes it easy to picture. Okay, so array adapter is for simple lists. What about simple adapter? When would you use that?
Simple adapter is handy when your data is a bit more complex. Instead of just a list of names, let's say you have a list of contacts and each one have a name, a phone number, and maybe an email address.
Ah, so it's like taking the data organization up a notch. Instead of just one piece of info per item, you have multiple things associated with each entry.
Yeah, exactly. To handle that, simple adapter uses a map structure for each item. You can think of a map like a tiny database where every piece of information has a key, like name or phone number, and then it has a corresponding value.
So it's like each item gets its own little profile with specific fields for different types of info.
Precisely. And when you set up the simple adapter, you tell it which layout to use, which keys in the map go with which pieces of data, and which text views in the layout should show those values.
That's pretty cool. So you can really control how each item looks, pulling data from specific places on the map and putting it right where you want it in the layout.
That's right. And that leads us to the powerhouse of adapters, base adapter. This is where you really unlock the full customization power.
Base adapter sounds intense. This is where it gets a bit more technical, right?
Well, it does take a bit more coding, but the flexibility you get is unmatched. With base adapter, you're basically creating your own custom adapter from the ground up. You decide exactly how everything looks and how it behaves.
So if array adapter is like using a pre-built template, base adapter is like getting all the raw materials and building your dream house from scratch.
That's a great way to put it. You have complete control over the layout, the data sources, and even how people interact with each item. You can have images, buttons, custom fonts, really anything you can think of, all within each item in your list or grid.
Wow, the possibilities are kind of endless.
Yeah.
But it sounds like it could get pretty complicated too. What are some of the key things you have to do when you're making a custom adapter with base adapter?
There are a few important methods you need to override, which is just a fancy way of saying you're redefining how those methods work.
Yeah.
First, you have getCount. This basically tells the list view or grid view how many items are in your data.
Makes sense. You need to let the control know how much data it's dealing with.
Then there's getItem, which gets the specific data item at a given position. So if the user scrolls to the fifth item in the list, getItem goes and fetches the data for that fifth item
Like a retrieval system, pulling the right data for each position as the user's looking through the list.
You got it. And you also have getItemid, which is for getting the ID of an item at a specific position if you're using IDs.
I can see how IDs would be helpful for, like, keeping track of each item, especially if you need to change or update specific items in the list.
Right. But the most important method to override is getView. This is where the magic happens.
Okay, I'm all ears. What does getView?
GetView is what creates and returns the view object that represents each individual item in your list or grid. You basically define the whole look and feel of each item right here in this method.
So this is where we get to be creative and customize the appearance of each item.
Absolutely. You decide what kinds of views to use, text views, image views, buttons, whatever you need, and how they're arranged within the layout. You can even add custom behaviors and animations.
Wow, that opens up a lot of possibilities. You could have lists with interactive elements, animations, unique visual styles.
Yeah.
It sounds like it takes a good understanding of layouts and how views work in Android, though.
It does. But that's part of the fun of Android development. You get to learn and play around with different techniques to make awesome user experiences.
I can definitely see that. So we've covered how adapters take that raw data and present it nicely in list view and grid view, from simple text lists with array adapter to more complex customized layouts with base adapter. But we've mostly talked about display. What about interaction? Can these adapters handle things like clicks and selections?
That's a great point. Adapters aren't just about static displays. They can actually respond to what the user does, making your lists and grids interactive.
Okay, now we're talking. How do we make these lists and grids come alive and actually respond to the user?
That's where event handling comes in. Android gives us special interfaces that let you define what happens when a user interacts with an item in a list view or grid view.
Interfaces. So these are like sets of rules that tell the adapter how to respond to specific events?
That's right. There are two main ones you'll want to know. The first one is adapter view on item selected listener. This one's used when the user selects an item in a list or grid, like when you choose an email from your inbox or tap on a photo in a gallery.
So it's about figuring out which item's been selected and then doing something based on that selection.
Exactly. This interface has two methods you can use, on item selected and on nothing selected.
And I'm assuming on item selected is triggered when the user actually selects something, and on nothing selected is for when they, well, don't select anything.
You got it. This is really useful for things like drop-down menus or spinners, where you might want to update other parts of your interface depending on what the user chooses. For example, let's say in a shopping app, if someone chooses a different size from a drop-down, it might update the available colors or the price.
So it's about making the app feel more connected and dynamic. What the user does in one place can affect other parts of the app.
Yeah, precisely. It's about making things smooth and intuitive for the user.
Okay, so that's adapter view on item selected listener covered. What about the other interface you mentioned?
The other one is adapterview.itemClickListener. This one's all about handling those clicks.
So if item selected listener is about selections, on item click listener is about those taps or clicks on individual items.
Right. It's how you make the app respond to those direct interactions, like tapping on a contact in your list to see their info, or clicking on a song in your music player to start playing it.
It's like adding that interactivity that makes the app feel more responsive, more alive.
Precisely. This interface has a method called onItemClick, where you decide what happens when an item gets clicked.
I'm guessing this method gives you some useful info, like the position of the item that was clicked, or maybe even some details about the data that goes with that item.
You're right. OnItemClick gives you the position of the clicked item, the ID of the view that was clicked, which can be helpful if you have multiple things you can click within an item, and even the ID of the item itself, if you're using those sites.
Wow, that's a lot of information to work with. You could create some pretty sophisticated actions based on the context of that click.
Exactly. And honestly, this is just the beginning when it comes to handling events in Android. There are tons of other interfaces and ways to respond to user actions, but these two, onItemSelectedListener and onItemClickListener, will give you a good foundation for building interactive lists and grids.
It's crazy how much goes into something as seemingly simple as showing a list or a grid. From those adapters that manage and present the data to these event handlers that make them interactive, there's so much happening behind the scenes.
It really shows how much thought and creativity goes into Android development. And it's a good reminder that even the most complex apps are built on these fundamental pieces.
I'm definitely feeling a lot more informed, but I'm also realizing how much more there is to learn. What would you say are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the biggest one is that adapters are like the hidden heroes of Android interfaces. They do all the hard work when it comes to displaying and managing data in lists and grids, and they open up a whole world of possibilities for customization and interactivity.
And that these adapters, along with those event handlers, turn those static lists and grids into dynamic elements that respond to the user, making the app feel more engaging and easy to use.
Exactly. It's all about creating a smooth and enjoyable experience for the user.
We've covered so much today, from calendars and time pickers to all the details of adapters and event handling. I'm feeling pretty inspired to explore all this further and see what I can make.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And remember, the document we're looking at also mentioned Recycle View, which is a more advanced way to handle large data sets efficiently. It's definitely worth checking out if you want to take your Android skills to the next level.
Good point. We'll make sure to include a link to some resources about that in the show notes for our listeners.
Perfect. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave everyone with a little challenge. Take a look at the apps you use every day. Look at those lists and grids, how they're organized, how they respond to what you do. Can you start to see those adapters and event handlers at work? It's a fun way to appreciate all the design and engineering that goes into making those apps we rely on.
That's a great challenge. It's like suddenly having X-ray vision for your phone, being able to see the inner workings of all those interfaces.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe this deep dive will give you an idea for the next big hit Android app.
The possibilities are definitely out there. Well, I think we've given our listeners a really good understanding of Android's visual controls, adapters, and event handling. Thanks so much for taking us on this journey. It's been really interesting and inspiring.
It's been my pleasure. And to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep building amazing things.
You know, it's crazy how we just take all these everyday app features for granted. We scroll through lists, we tap on grid items, but we rarely ever stop to think about all the stuff that's happening behind the scenes to make it all work.
Yeah, I guess it's a sign of good design, when something feels so natural and easy to use. But as we've seen in this deep dive, there's actually a lot of smart engineering that goes into creating that seamless experience.
Absolutely. And speaking of smart engineering, you mentioned earlier that our source document points us toward Recycle View. What makes it so different from the list view and grid view we talked about?
Recycle View is kind of like the next level of list and grid displays. It's built to handle really big data sets in a super efficient way. Imagine scrolling through a list with thousands of items. Recycle View makes sure that everything stays smooth and responsive, even on devices that aren't super powerful.
So if I'm building an app that might have huge lists, like, say, a social media feed that scrolls forever, or a music library with tons of songs, Recycle View would be the way to go.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about squeezing out the best performance
Yeah.
and making sure that the app feels fast and snappy, even when it's dealing with a ton of information.
That's pretty impressive. I can see how that would be valuable. But I have a feeling that it probably comes with a bit more complexity compared to list view and grid view.
Well, there's definitely a bit of a learning curve, yeah. But the benefits usually outweigh the extra effort, especially for those apps that have to handle lots and lots of data.
Right.
And there are a bunch of resources out there to help developers get up to speed with Recycle View, so it's not as daunting as it might seem.
That's good to know. It's cool to see how Android keeps getting better and giving us developers these powerful tools to create awesome apps.
Absolutely. And this deep dive has really only scratched the surface. There's a whole universe of other stuff in Android development, like sensors, multimedia, location services. I mean, the list just keeps going.
It's kind of overwhelming to think about all the possibilities. We've gone from simple calendar displays to the ins and outs of adapters and event handling, and now we're getting a peek at these even more advanced things like Recycle View. It feels like every time we learn something new, a whole new world opens up.
That's the exciting part about technology. There's always more to learn, more to explore, and more to build. I hope this deep dive has encouraged people to keep learning about Android.
I think it has. We've given everyone a solid understanding of visual controls, adapters, and event handling. They're ready to appreciate how the apps they use every day are designed and maybe even start building their own apps.
Definitely. And don't forget, even those simple elements like lists and grids have a lot going on behind them. By understanding those basic building blocks, you start to get a much deeper understanding of how complex and creative it is to create those smooth, user-friendly experiences we all expect.
Well said. So, to everyone listening, as you go about your day, take a second to look at your phone a little differently. See those lists, grids, calendars, time pickers, and think about all those adapters and event handlers working away behind the scenes. You might be surprised at how much more you notice now.
Yeah, and you never know, maybe this deep dive will spark an idea for the next amazing Android app.
There's no limit to what you can create. Thanks again for being our guide on this deep dive. It's been a really eye-opening and fun journey.
It was my pleasure. And to everyone out there, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep making awesome things.